Alrighty, welcome back to episode 7 of video game development, and in this episode we're going to be talking about really starting to personalize our game and getting going with art and making our game as unique to ourselves as possible, so that we're just not making another copycat game or all the exact same game, which we've been doing pretty much so far with basically all of our games being the exact same. So the first thing that we need to talk about is this Google document I have open in front of me right here, as it's just a blank page right now. But you can see I have it titled as a video game planning document. And this is going to be our document that we should create to plan out our entire video game, so that anyone who ever has any questions or wants to join the team with our game can create or just log on to this document and see everything that you have planned out and your vision for the game. And when I first started this, I didn't really like the idea either, so it would make sense to me if you're kind of like put off by the idea of creating a Google Doc just to plan out your game first. But let me show you some of the really cool concepts that you can get going with this, and it really gets you start to get passionate about your game, because a big thing about making your video games is making them actually fun for yourself and not just sitting there and kind of getting bored of your game. Otherwise, it's not going to be a fun project, and we want to make this as enjoyable as possible so that you can actually have fun creating your game, that it doesn't feel like work, that it's an enjoyable process. So here's an example of one of my video game planning documents that I've created in the past. This was for a game I created last year, or started to work on, that was primarily around archery and level terrain. It was a multiplayer game, and I just had some really cool concepts here, and all this really was some art concepts and some YouTube videos of kind of style that I wanted, and just a list of features. But once I followed a Udemy course online and started to pick up this process a lot more, I got into what's called creating a GDD. And this covers everything in your document that is all the important information that anyone were to know if they were to want to buy your game, or say you wanted to pitch your game to get funding for it to someone. This would have all the information in your game so that anyone can look at it and just know. So we've got stuff like your genre, your target audience, your controls, your setting, your platforms that you're going to need, and your game moment. This is the key thing that we're going to be talking about, and this is the one individual moment, like that 1 minute of a gameplay that you envision in your head when you're thinking about what your game's going to be. So your game moment is like a 60-second period where you can just sit there and just like know that this is your game. So for this game that I was working on, it's a jungle survival RPG game, and this was from last year as well. But I really wanted strong fight scenes with really strong environments, beautifully overwhelming, really good combat, and enjoyable fun to play. So I was picturing something really artsy and heavy, and something that you could just sit there and stand back, kind of like Firewatch meets RuneScape, survival-esque, very visually heavy, beautiful game, and focused primarily around the combat and in a multiplayer scenario, right? And this was the kind of moment that I had for my game envisioned, so that everything that I was working towards in my game would be perfecting this one individual moment. So you need to make sure you have a core game moment figured out before you really get going on your game, because otherwise you're just going to be building without knowing what it is that you're actually building, so you don't know if the thing that you're doing is going to be actually helping towards you getting your game moment. For example, we just did a coin system in our last video, but what if we don't really want a coin system in our game, right? And so you kind of have to know if you want to put this in your game or not, and be able to work with it from there. So then some other stuff you can just have is a general summary, some core player experience. This is similar to your game moment, just like overall experience in the game, not a single specific moment. You've got a central theme, kind of design, art style that you want, remarkability, so like the main highlights and stuff that's going on in your game, and what sites that you want it to be launched on. So for example, I want this game to be released on Steam. Maybe you don't have plans to even release it at all, it's just for your friends or whatever, right? And then some other concepts or games that you can compare your game to as well, right? So I just have some UI kind of ideas here, some general planning that I just kind of jot down some ideas, and then we have big main art direction. So we have a summary of overall what the cameras, the lighting, the perspective will feel like in the game. So this is the kind of art style that I was going for in this game, and then we can talk about like characters like this, settings like this sort of polish and effects with these type of color palettes and other random detailed information. And you can just drag and drop as many images to your heart's content until you have a rough idea of a game document that you want, right? So I'm going to go into my document here, and the main things that I'm going to want to cover are game moment, and I'm going to write that in here, and I'm going to want primarily art direction. And some other information we can talk about is software that is needed to create our game, and platforms that we want to release our game on, and additional information. So we can just talk about, for example, my game is a low poly third-person game, and so third person isn't exactly an art style, but it is additional information, right? So we know we want it low poly, we know we want it kind of blocky. So the main game moment that I'm going for is a coin collector. It's a type of platformer game, so we know it's a third-person platformer, and I don't know, single player, and just start jotting down ideas like this. Minimal input and a very relaxed feeling is the sort of game that I'm going for. My highlight of a game moment is finishing a level, and I also really do like this idea of really enjoyable scenery. So art heavy, enjoyable to look at, and I really like this idea of a very audio-based game. I think audio is just as important as visuals itself. So when I say art heavy, I also know that I want it to be audio-based and heavy. Right, so my core moment that I'm going to want is when you finish a level, it's going to be really enjoyable. There's probably going to be some nice animation, there's going to be some really nice sound effects, and the levels are just going to be really beautiful to look at. And platforms that I'm going to want to release it is probably Mac and PC and Linux. And software needed for now is just Blender and Unity, I think. Yeah, and so we can just take a look, and now I can go through and just start dragging and dropping different ideas of my art direction of what I want to be in here, and then we can start playing around with getting a basic level blocked out in Unity. Alrighty, so I just spent a few minutes here finding some images that I like that sort of get my game like feeling how I want it in my mind. So maybe I won't actually reach quite what this is, but this has a rough idea of the kind of aesthetic that I'm going for. And you can really put anything you want in here at all, anything that gets you hyped up and excited for the game, because it's always good to be really passionate about your project. Otherwise you'll go through game after game after game not really knowing what to do. So really the main thing that I'm trying to get across here is I really like the good lighting and the artsy sort of feelings in these low poly pictures, but you can see I've got like a bridge here of this kind of aesthetic that I like with this sort of scenario and look of the scenery with this depth of field. I really enjoy that. I really like the lighting in this photo here, and the depth and the distance of how full this one is. And I know a lot of people are thinking about these sort of zombie games, and this really has a good low poly aesthetic to it by one of my favorite YouTubers, David Stenforce. So this is a great example here of the sort of game that I'm going for. And so that document is just there so that I can look at it, go back whenever I need. If I ever need to pitch my idea to anyone, it's here, it's done, and then we don't have to worry about that. Now we can open up Unity and really start to get to work on our game here. So you may notice things are a little bit different, and before we get going with talking about why the grass is green and the coins are a little bit different place and all that, we just got to talk about some bugs that we got going on. So thanks to Logan, shout out to him for noticing some of these, we've actually got some issues in some of our scripts that didn't come up in my videos but may have come up when you downloaded some of the scripts. For example, you have a player script that is titled New Player, but the script in the code isn't titled New Player, so our script won't actually be compatible and run, because when you go into your player script, it's called public class player, deriving from mono behavior. But if you check inside of Unity, your script may be called new player. But remember, our script has to be named the exact same thing as our actual code says. So either you have to change the name of this to just say player, or you have to go into your script and make sure that it just says player. But either way, make sure that those are the same, and then your player script should run just fine. The other thing is, you need to make sure that in your coin script, the player that it's looking for, so remember we're searching for our public game object player, and when we start our script, we're saying player equals, so this game object player equals gameObject.find, whatever game object is named player with a capital P spelled exactly like that. So for me that works perfectly fine because my player right here is capital P player. But if your player is named anything else, it won't work at all, right? Because your script is trying to find a player that isn't titled player. So just make sure in your coin script this word right here is titled the exact same thing as this word right here that is your actual player. Otherwise that won't work. Okay, so now that all of our bugs are out of the way, we can start talking about art. What's going on here? So the reason the ground is green is because I actually recorded this tutorial and it all didn't work because there was no audio. So we're re-recording it now, but that's all good. So the reason the ground is green is because we're starting to texturize and make our world look as unique as possible. I competed in a Ludum Dare competition, a Ludum Dare 43 actually. My submission wasn't that good. It was my first game jam ever. And if you don't know what that is, it's basically a game competition or a game jam where everyone across the world that wants to make games has 48 hours or 72 hours, depending on what you compete in, to make a game based off a theme that they provide for you. So I created this game. One of the things they suggested in the game jam competition forms is make your game look as unique as possible, or make your game look as different from a standard Unity game or Unreal game or whatever as possible. So there's some very standard things that just scream like this is a Unity game. Specifically, this skybox right here. So you can see that sort of sun looking like that, this blue gradient to the gray bottom, that is a very strong Unity-esque. So we want to start changing things so that it looks as different as possible, right? So one of the first things that I changed was the ground texture, this green color. And how I did that was I just right-clicked in our hierarchy, or our project, sorry, and I clicked create, and you go over to this little option material, and we can call this whatever we want. I'm just going to call this one white. And with this material, we can go into our albedo texture right here and click on this little box and set the material to any color that we want. So I just want this one to be white, and then it's as easy as dragging it right onto our ground plane. Right, and so we're just going to create, I've got a few different ones here. I've got a wood texture, I've got a stone texture, I've just got a blue texture and a ground texture. And so I created this green ground texture, and I'm just going to drag it onto my ground so it looks a little bit more like a grass feeling. So that when we play our game, it gives it even just that little difference, right? And then what we need to start doing, once we have our ground to look a little bit nicer, is we just need to start planning out, or blocking out a basic level, because there's nothing fun about having just a plain ground like this, right? So there are two different ways that we can do this, especially when it talks about a ground. So this level has just flat ground. Now we can make terrain that goes up and down and all around or whatever, right? Or we can just put things into our world. So for my level, I'm creating a platformer game. And so I'm going to create my terrain in Blender because I just want there to be platforms and a little bit of rough ground or whatever, right? But you may want to create much more advanced terrain, and that can be done in Unity with the terrain system. But for now, I'm just going to start blocking out my level in a way that I like it, and then we can go in and talk about Unity terrain afterwards if that's something that you're into. But what I'm going to do is go to right-click here and go to 3D Object and just click Cube. And I've got a little cube that spawned way off in the distance here. You can see there it is. And I'm just going to drag it right on over to my player here. And what we can do is click the Scale tool and just drag it out much larger, much wider, much taller, and then we can give it a nice blue texture or whatever, right? And we can play around with these different blocks and kind of just start to play around with what our level is going to look like. So there could be a little patch of water or something, and we can go into this and we can right click and go to rename, and we can just call this water, whatever, right? And what we want to do is just make sure that we have a little bit of something to look at. So I'm going to create a new cube. I'm going to take it out from underneath there and move it over here. I'll probably drag it up in height like this, maybe give it a nice stone color, and we'll just keep playing around with a bit of a level here so that we have something interesting to play around with. Something else that might be useful for you is if you take this rotation tool, you can actually just grab these lines here and just rotate our platforms and make them different heights or angles or whatever, right? And you can really start to get a basic level blocked out in Unity here. So start to play around with that, and I'll come back in about 1 second. Alrighty, so I have a very basic level kind of just blocked out here, something to look at for my player to enjoy a little bit, and for you to enjoy while you're making your game, because that's always important, and don't forget that. But you can see I've got a little bit of a hill thing going on here, and I think we're looking pretty cool, just putting some coins in here. There are a few things to be made aware of here though. So when I click play on my game, you can see now we start to have something a little bit more interesting and a cool dynamic. So you can run around and collect your coins, and these have hitboxes, so you can't run through them and all that. But some interesting stuff is if we don't watch out for a camera, especially if we're in third person, we may glitch through our stuff like this, and that can provide some really weird situations with your camera, and especially when you come near stuff like these walls over here. So if you're using a third-person camera specifically, just watch out for your camera because it may hit some stuff, and we can provide a box collider and just not let your player rotate that way, but it's probably better to actually let the player have the freedom to do what he wants in the game and just work the level around your player's mechanics. So you can see just a nice little bit of a hill here, some more coins, and something else to watch out for is make sure that your angle of your slopes that you're using, especially right here, aren't too steep, right? Because if this angle or this slope right here is too steep, your player may not be able to walk over it. So just make sure it's a little bit longer and not so steep, and then you'll probably be better safe than sorry. So you can see we've got a little bit of a level here, and that's something that I'm pretty happy with to start with in the game for now. So some other stuff we can talk about is the skybox and the terrain system, and organization. So one of the big things that you are supposed to or should watch out for when creating a game is organizing. So I'm just going to create a new empty in my hierarchy here, and I'm going to name this World Objects. So this will be acting as if it's a folder in the center of our world so that all of our other objects can go under it. So if you just right click on this little tab right here and click reset position, all of our positions will go to 0, and we can just take all of these objects that we spawned in and pull them under world objects here, and then fold that away, and it will look nice and clean. And also here we can create a folder just by going right click create folder, and we can just name this materials and drag in all of our materials or scripts or whatever, just to make sure our project and our asset window here is a little bit more organized. You can see I've already got a scripts folder right here, and that's just to make sure that everything's a little bit more organized, and you can do that in your own way. So now let's start talking about the skybox and the terrain, as we have already been talking about. But let's actually start to do some work on that. So we'll start with the terrain here. What you can do is you can right click in your hierarchy and go under 3D object, create terrain. And what that will do is it will automatically spawn in a terrain. And while I'm not going to use terrain systems in my game, you can see it is something that can be used, and if that's your sort of thing, I will show you how to do that to the best of my ability. So the whole terrain object is a transformable mesh, and what you can do is you have different tools here in which you can interact, including painting different textures on your terrain, smoothing out the terrain, changing the height to a specified height, and raising and lowering the terrain. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the raise terrain tool. You can see we get this little blue circle that appears. Now this corresponds to whichever asset that we're using to paint on our terrain with. So I'm going to just click on the biggest circle here, and we can change the size however large we want it or however small we want it just based on this, and we can change what's called the opacity. So if the opacity is set to 100 and we click, you can see it's going to rocket up into the air, and it's going to create terrain instantaneously, super fast. But if we set it all the way down to 0, you can see it's not going to do anything. If we bring it up to 17 or so, you can see it's very light and slow. And it's a lot easier to work with terrain if it's a bit slower, especially for mine. So I'm going to leave it around something like 15, and I'm going to actually go down to maybe the second size down so it's a little bit more transparent on these sides, and bring the size up to something like 31. And that's just because that's just how I like to work with terrain. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start painting in some hills in the corner here, and you can see it's pretty rough and random, and it's kind of slow process at first, but make sure that your mouse keeps moving, and as you go along, it will just continue to raise the terrain as long as your mouse is moving. And you can start to build out some interesting shapes that look something like this. And for this example, all I'm doing really is building this hill in here, and you can see it's quite rough and odd shaped, and that's not really something that I want for my terrain, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to our smooth tool, and that's the one with this little water droplet icon right here. And if I click on that and bring my brush size up quite a bit and bring my opacity up quite a bit, and we just paint over this, it's going to automatically smooth out all that rough stuff and just make it nice and rounded edges, more like actual ground for us. And you just keep dragging your mouse around until you get something that you like. Now, the only other tool, well, there's 2 or 3 tools that I would also use, but the only other one that I would use for modifying is this adjustment of the height. And what we can do is, you see we have a specified height here of 25 and set to flatten. If we click flatten, all the terrain is going to automatically adjust to 25 feet, like so. But we don't want that, so I'm going to undo that. And I'm just going to click here and just drag along. And you can see it's going to automatically bring our height all the way up to 25 and flatten it there, even if we go over terrain we've already done before. So I'm going to bring that number down to something more like 15, and I'm going to bring the opacity down to something more like 15 as well, and our brush size to something more like 30-ish. And I'm just going to go in here and start to drag around in this sort of area so we get a nice flat terrain, just something to work with here. And so that can be like a platform on our level. And then I'm going to bring our raised terrain height and just make sure we have a little bit of a hill sort of thing going up towards it, like so. And then I'm going to take our smooth out terrain tool and just smooth that all out quite a bit, so that we actually have something that we can start to walk up here. Now, the thing is, a lot of this terrain can be very difficult to maneuver with your character, and that's why I find it quite difficult to work with in Unity, unless you really start to know what you're doing. It can have some quite amazing advantages, especially with some of the new upcoming updates that Unity is working on as well, with some of these systems. But I think for now, I'm just going to stick with Blender for my game, because that works out great. But you can see you can get some quite cool systems going on here with this sort of hilly system and terrain building. Now, what about colors? So we have a nice sort of terrain here that we can take a look at in our game if we just hit play, but it's all white and it's not very fun. Now, one of the big advantages that Unity has for its terrain system is actually going into the terrain and painting on individual textures. So what we can do is, if I just open up Google here, we can search for a seamless texture. So I'm going to search seamless grass texture. And what that will do is it's going to bring up a bunch of textures, and we can take any of these will work just fine. And you can see the reason it's seamless is because this edge is going to match with this edge perfectly in the same way that this edge is going to match with this edge perfectly. So I'm going to right click on this and I'm going to click Save Image As, and that works just fine, just on my desktop. And there we go, we just downloaded our image. So what I can do is, when I go into the terrain here and just drag our grass texture into our assets window, if I click on our terrain and click edit textures and click add texture, I can simply drag our grass texture into here, and we're going to just click add. And what it's going to do is it's automatically going to map our new texture into our terrain. And you can maybe notice that it's looping. So it's the exact same texture, just looping over and over and over and over. So what we can actually do is go back into Google here and just find another texture, seamless, let's just say dirt texture, and download that as well. And we can actually paint these textures over each other to match perfectly. So I'm just going to take this first one because it's there and it looks good to me, and I'm going to save image as. And sure, dirt seamless works fine for me. Just close that and go back into Unity. Now when I drag our dirt texture in, it will do the exact same thing as our grass texture, hopefully here. Yep, and go into our terrain and click Edit Textures and Add Texture, and just drag our dirt texture in and click Add. Now we can take this dirt texture and just paint over our terrain, and you can see it's going to slowly fade the new texture into the old texture, as if it's a completely seamless thing. So we can create some sort of path networks here, and we can take the opacity of our green one and maybe bump it up and paint back over this one, maybe bring it down, maybe bring our size up a bit, and just kind of make this disappear a little bit, right? Because it will function all the exact same. It's just a nice little dirt texture here. And we can bring our trail down like this, back over to our little guy, and then we just have some sort of a plateau here where our guy can walk up if he can even make it up the terrain. And you can do this with all sorts of stuff, and there's a lot more advanced tutorials on how to do this sort of system, but you can see there now we have a seamless grass texture, and it gives it a lot more of a realistic look into our game with the grass and the dirt feeling there. But you can see if your texture if your terrain is not set up properly, it can be quite sketchy, and you can often glitch through it, especially if you have extraordinarily steep terrain like this. You bump into that sort of issue quite a bit. So you need to be careful when you're actually making your terrain to do the correct steps and procedures into making it. But that's sort of how you start to get a rough draft of a terrain system built in there. Even though I will not use this in my game at all, it's completely there for you to look into if you want. So now let's talk about skyboxes for a second, because a skybox is something that is crucial to your game. And while they are also difficult to build from scratch, we have this great thing called the Unity Asset Store. So there's a lot of stuff that Unity provides for you that will automatically have stuff that is already pre-built and it has that same Unity like attached feeling to it. So if you play a game that uses these, you often know that it's, oh, that's a Unity game. That's why I had us make our character from scratch when we could have just imported the Unity default character. Instead, like for our textures here, we could have just went here and import package and imported an environment package, which can have a bunch of textures already pre-assigned for you, like grass textures and so on, but they won't be as nice. There's even auto tree generating things and everything, but it's not as nice as going into what Unity has provided called the Asset Store. So in the Asset Store, this is where hundreds of people go online and upload their assets for us to download and use in our games for sometimes for free, other times for cost. But what we can do is we can go into here and we can search anything that we want. So say we wanted a character, we could just download it directly from the Unity Asset Store. Say we wanted a skybox, which in this case we do, we can just go and find it right there. And so it's searching Skybox. It's got 15,000 results, right? And there are tons of Skyboxes for free that we can just download and incorporate into our game. So all you need to do is go through these Skyboxes and find one that suits your game. So for me, I'm going to want a sort of low poly Skybox, and we'll see if there's anything that sort of matches my aesthetic. But you can search up whatever you want and just find the sort of thing that you're looking for. So Poly Skies, that one's $12, but this one over here is free Skybox. So I'm going to go into here and make sure you read through the conditions and stuff before you install it. But once you found one that you can enjoy, just click download, and it's going to prompt you. If you haven't logged in, it's going to prompt you to log in. But if you have logged in, of course, that will be fine. So let me just log in here. And once you have logged in, it will ask you if you would like to import it. It will download it, and then you can import that package directly into your game. Now, I wouldn't suggest just going and finding all the assets that you want for free and just creating the game fully based off of the asset store, because there's a lot of sketchy, well, not sketchy, it just, then you're not creating your own game, right? So it would be better for you to create some of this stuff from the beginning. So now that you can see that I've downloaded the package here, I just hit import, and these are all the different files that it's going to import into my game, right into my asset window here, and I am a-okay with that, so I'm just going to hit import. So there, now that it's downloaded, we can go back to our scene view here, and you can see we've got this interestingly named folder with a bunch of different textures and shaders and prefabs and everything. So here is a pre-made blue skybox texture for us, and what we can do is simply take our texture. Now your whatever one you download may not have a pre-made material for you and you have to make one from scratch, but that's not that difficult. Ooh, this one even comes with some assets for us that we can drag in. That's pretty neat, but I don't think I will use those in my game. But you can see right there, we just got a nice little fence or some trees or any sort of stuff like that. But that's the power of the asset store, right? You can just simply do that sort of stuff. Sorry, got a little distracted there. But what we'll do is if you already have a pre-made skybox material like this, it's really quite easy to implement. But if you don't, you're going to have to create a new material. And then you're going to have to change your texture type. So you'll just go like this, create material, and we can call this our skybox. And in your skybox, you're going to have to change it from standard right here. So under mobile, I believe it is, you can go and click on skybox. And then it's going to prompt you asking for 6 textures because you may be given 6 textures if you're not given a material, in which case you need to drag them in and it will automatically set up the material for you. But they have already made this material for me, so I can delete that. So now we need to go into our window and go down to this lighting tab and just click on settings. And it will bring up all of our different lighting settings for us. And in our environment, you can see our skybox material is set to our default skybox material. So if we click on this little dot next to it, we can go through and select all of our materials. And I'm just going to click our new skybox material and it will automatically load in our new skybox material. So maybe I didn't choose the best one for my game, but I just chose a very generic light cartoony blue game, and you can see now it gives my game a whole new environment feeling. It feels very very cartoony with the clouds already pre-built in and a very blue, almost cold feeling in our game. And you can really see it starts to shape out what your game looks like. So maybe this isn't the exact skybox that I want, but now that you know how to put skyboxes into your game, you can go through and start to really form out and play around, even just with these placeholders, what your game is going to start to look like. And of course, once you have all these in, you can then go into Blender and turn these into buildings or whatever, right? And start to form out an actual level. And our skybox is even rotating. Look at that. So our clouds are spinning nicely around our character here. So that gives it a very, very cartoony feeling, but something that is kind of nice. And yeah, so with all that said and done, you can really start to form out your level in a way that you like. And that is really all that we need to cover in this episode. We can talk about further mechanics into all sorts of different stuff in the future, but I hope you're starting to form out your game to something that you're enjoying to play and actually having fun with, especially building the art and aesthetics here. But that is all from me for this episode. Thank you all so much for watching, and see you in hopefully the next episode, which soon hopefully will start happening more regularly rather than these super random month apart and then 10 in a row or whatever. So yeah, anyways, thank you all for watching. See you next time.